Okay, welcome everyone to our Go Learn webinar today. Usually you see Christoph Dressler here. I'm covering for him as he's out of town. I'm Sandra Serna, I'm the Go Learn program coordinator. And today we have Jane England and Tim Slover joining us for the webinar. Just a few housekeeping things. If you haven't joined us before, we are Go Learn, the Alumni Travel program. We offer faculty-led travel all around the world, both domestically and internationally. And Tim and Jane lead our London on Stage trip. And while I haven't traveled with them, I've been in a lot of their pre-departure and reunion meetings. And I wish I could travel with them because they are truly exceptional trip leaders. And we get nothing but amazing feedback. And they've already done one webinar with us before. So if you were on that London scrapbook webinar, you've already heard how great they are. With questions, we're going to hold those to the end. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can submit them in the Q&A below, and I'll be keeping track of those, and you can go ahead and submit those anytime throughout the webinar, and at the end we'll take some time to answer as many of those as we can. So I'll hand the time over to Tim and Jane. Thank you, Tim and Jane.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for attending this. I wish I could see you all in person. I bet we all wish that. Anyway, we're very pleased to spend this hour with you to talk about how a young man from a country town who never went to university became either one of the greatest dramatist poets in the English-speaking world, or the greatest dramatist poet in the English-speaking world. You get to take your pick. What I won't talk about, because I can't talk about it, is the native genius that can pop up anywhere in the world, in anybody, and certainly did in the boy and man William Shakespeare. That native talent is the essential ingredient that's unteachable and unquantifiable. What I can talk about, or at least I can briefly dip into, is the set of circumstances that gave that talent the chance to grow and shine. Now, I've been doing a little bit of Zoom teaching like everybody has at the U, and here's what I regret the most, is that I can't look directly into your electronic eyes as I think I'm doing now, because I will be talking from notes, and I apologize for that, but I have to tell you that the alternative, if I didn't have notes, would be far worse. Now, I'm going to talk some facts and figures, some history, and some examples, and Jane is going to supply the living, breathing personal stories that make those facts and figures come alive from her, frankly, vast storehouse of experiences in the places where William Shakespeare lived and worked. So let's get started. William Shakespeare was born in April of 1564. If you jot that date down, that can be kind of a basic date that we'll be working from. So 1564. We don't know the exact date really in April, but the record of his christening at Holy Trinity Church, so let's see that Holy Trinity Church picture now if you've got it. The record of his christening lists a date of April 25th, and it was traditional to have your child, thank you, to have your child christened as soon as you could after the child was born. And so they pick April 23rd, 2 days before April 25th as Shakespeare's birthday. There's also another reason for that, and that is that April 23rd is St. George's Day in England. That's the patron saint of England. And since, there's something mystical about Shakespeare having been born on April 23rd. Also, we do know Shakespeare's death date, which was also April 23rd in 1616. So there's a kind of significance of being born and dying on the same calendar day if you're England's greatest literary hero. Well, Shakespeare was born in a town called Stratford upon Avon, the Avon River. Stratford was a small but prosperous town in the Midlands of England, in the county of Warwickshire. It's about 80 miles northwest of London. Town had a population of around 5,000 people in the 1560s, and really until the end of the century, it was pretty stable at about 5,000 people. but it was surrounded by smaller little agricultural settlements like Shottery. Shottery is where his future wife, Anne Hathaway, grew up on Hewlands Farm. So this would be a good time to see a picture of Anne Hathaway's cottage, if you have it. I actually can't see that screen, so I won't know. Another town nearby is Wincott, where his mother was from. Another town nearby was Snitterfield, where his father was from. So think of Stratford as this, great, thank you. Now I can't see my notes though. Let's see. Here we go. So think of Stratford as this town, this sort of a 5,000 member market town with lots of little satellite settlements around it, all of which Shakespeare would have known. Now, Stratford was just big enough to have one of everything. It had a guild hall. It had a venerable stone church and churchyard, Holy Trinity Church, which you just saw. Now, Jane, you've been inside that church a lot. What's it like? What's your experience of that church where Shakespeare was christened and then also where he was buried?
Well, it is a beautiful, peaceful spot, considering how significant it is because of Shakespeare's connection. And there are a fair number of visitors, but it always feels incredibly tranquil and peaceful. And as you enter, there's a row of beautiful trees. I can't remember what kind of trees those are as you enter into the church yard, but you have to duck to enter the actual church itself because it has an extremely low doorway. They haven't like enlarged it or made it more modern. So you really do get a feeling like you're stepping back into the 1500s. The church itself, as you saw from the outside, and I'm about to show you an interior, is just beautiful and small. There's usually an organist playing. You can attend services there. Of any place to visit that has such historical significance, it doesn't feel like it's been destroyed by too many people coming to visit it. And so I have fond memories of just walking through it, but also hearing the music there that they have playing all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful. So Stratford had that church. That was an old church, by the way, even in Shakespeare's day. It was a 15th century church. And like I said, they have a guild hall, which we'll get to a little bit later. They had a royally appointed school. They also had a market cross. Oh yeah, there's the inside. Yeah, can you see? Yeah, and there's the baptismal font where Shakespeare was actually christened. Gosh, we were all so much younger then. That, by the way, it's broken. So you think, well, you know, why did they break it? They didn't actually. At the Restoration or at the Reformation during the English Civil War, that got they thought they'd lost it, but in fact, the person that was at that church had hidden it, so it was buried, and it was unearthed a couple hundred years later and brought back to where it would have been there. Okay. Okay. So the river was important. The Avon River was important because you could obviously transport goods back and forth from this market town. Mostly they went south to London. Most everything went south to London. That's still true. People all over England complain that too much happens to London, not enough to other places. Will Shakespeare was the first child of Mary and John Shakespeare to survive infancy. And this is a really interesting, this takes me into the period about as much as anything does. Because his older sister Joan, who was born 6 years before him, had died as an infant. And also who would have been older sister Margaret, born 2 years before him, died in infancy. So though Will Shakespeare was the third child, he was the first one to survive. He would have 5 more siblings, only one of which, another Joan, they recycled that name, would outlive him. Infant mortality in Warwickshire was not uncommon. 9% of babies died within a week of birth, 11% more before they were a month old. In the decade William was born, there were 62.8 average baptisms and 42.8 average child burials per year. So they just barely kept the births above the death rate of babies, of children. 3 months after William's birth, on July 11th, 1564, written in that church record, which in that other picture is what I'm pointing to with the pen, written in the church record beside a boy who died on or about July 11th, are the Latin words hic incipit pestis. Here begins the plague. 237 people in Stratford died in the next 6 months, including a family of 4 on the same side of Henley Street where William was born. Some people think the most amazing thing William did in his whole life was survive infancy. The average lifespan in England at this time was 47 years old. In London, it was actually younger. But William's father, John, lived to 70. His mother lived to 71. So when William died at 52, it was considered premature for a Shakespeare. His sister Joan, the second Joan, lived to be 77 years old. And they all grew up in that home there on Henley Street. Jane, you've been to that home lots of times. What's it like? What are your impressions?
Well, I have to say, unlike the quiet tranquility of Trinity Church, it is quite, if people go to one property, they tend to go to the birthplace. But it is beautiful. And if you manage to kind of get past the large groups of school children, etc., you can sit in the garden there and you can explore in the house. You can see how the gloves were made that his father, John, made. It's beautiful and fascinating. And there are often actors performing in the yard and outside the windows of the home itself. So even though the street itself and then the large number of people going there can be a little bit more rambunctious, the home itself is authentic, and you can really get a sense of what it was like to live in the mid 1500s. Thank
you very much. As far as we know, those actors weren't working when Shakespeare was living in that house. Will's mother was Mary Arden. Arden was a famous name. In fact, there were in Warwickshire, there were aristocratic Ardens, and she claimed to be a cadet branch of those sort of yeoman aristocrats. She was the daughter of a farmer. John Shakespeare, her husband, also the son of a farmer, but John was thoroughly a town man. He wanted to live in town and he wanted to do town kinds of things. So as Jane mentioned, he made leather gloves. And if you put up that picture of the leather gloves, you can see that this was quite a big deal. Everybody wore gloves, right? Because you know, when you worked, you needed to have gloves on. They were almost phobic about that. But also those kind of fancy gloves you're seeing there, those were the kind of gloves that you wore maybe in your cap if you were an aristocrat, or you wore over your belt, you wore it. So everybody had gloves around all the time. If you were a knight, you used gloves to challenge other people. Well, there are many references to gloves in Shakespeare's day. And John Shakespeare both made the gloves and sold them from a shop right there in the house on Henley Street on the ground floor. It was a 2-story house. Here's a glove reference in Shakespeare you may recognize. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. That's from Romeo and Juliet, Act 2. The clown in Twelfth Night in Act 3 says, to see this age, a sentence is but a cheverel glove to a good wit. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. A cheverel glove was made of kid skin, soft leather, kind of like the ones in the picture. Not meant to be worn, actually, but meant to be displayed. And a cheverel glove was reversible. So the clown is saying that a sentence can mean anything nowadays. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. In the history plays, as I mentioned, knights challenge each other to duels by throwing their gloves down at each other's feet. These would have been fancy gloves, the kind worn in the hat or over a belt. In Henry V, for example, the disguised king uses a glove to foment a quarrel, kind of a joke for him, between two of his soldiers. And when finally at the end of the play and he's won the battle and everything's happy, he comes clean, admits that he really fomented this whole thing, and he fills a glove with coins and gives it to the offended soldier. That's not insignificant, how much gloves come into these plays. It's part of what makes Shakespeare, Shakespeare. Well, John became a very successful entrepreneur and businessman in Stratford. And among other things he did, he bought and sold wool. That was known in those days as being a brogger. He was not licensed to do that, and that got him into some trouble. He also lent out money at interest, loaned out money at interest. That was okay, as long as you kept your interest rate below 10%, which he did. But in a litigious age, and the Elizabethan age was incredibly litigious, this kind of thing, this entrepreneurial businessman aspect, often led to legal disputes from time to time. And we know, quite recently, these court records were unearthed, that John sent his son at least once to London. That happened in 1588. So Will is 24 by this time, to file a complainant's bill before the Queen's Bench in Westminster. It was a real estate dispute that he had with the Lambert family, also living in Warwickshire. That's an important date too, and it's fairly recent that we found that court record that puts Shakespeare in London by 1588. Now, being a successful businessman also meant that John Shakespeare was eligible to join the Guild. The Guild was an amalgamation of business interests that look after the affairs of Stratford and supplied it with its civic officials. He could be an alderman on the town council. You weren't elected to this position, you were appointed to this position. And by virtue of being a successful businessman, he became that. He also had other, this is John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, had other civic duties. For a while, he was the ale taster, which sounds like a pretty good job, but it was actually a job of much responsibility, because in those days, hardly anybody drank water. You drank a kind of, because they knew what was in the water and it wasn't good. So they would brew this sort of weak ale, and he was the one that made sure that it was free of disease and healthful. He served as chief alderman for a while, and eventually, though Will was still a little boy at the time, he served as bailiff, which was the equivalent of mayor of Stratford. During Will's teenage years, his father's fortunes began to decline. It wasn't that he ran out of money. It wasn't that he couldn't pay his debts, although that's what people used to think. It's pretty well demonstrated now that he had plenty of money all through his life. That's a whole different lecture as to why maybe his fortunes began to decline. But when he was in his prime, John Shakespeare, as mayor, as alderman, as wine or as ale taster, he had the right to do two things which turned out to be crucial to Will's life and career. Two things. Without both of these things, they're both vital events in Will's life. It's very doubtful that Will would ever have become the Shakespeare we all know. It all happened because John Shakespeare was an alderman. Here's the first thing. In 1569, when Will Shakespeare was 5 years old, the theater came to Stratford. Now, the theater traveling troops were not the only entertainment that Will saw. Will almost certainly saw what were called the mystery plays in the nearby town of Coventry that were still doing these plays. And it sounds like they must have been like whodunits. Mystery actually is from an old French word. They were really Bible stories, a series of 15 to 20-minute medieval plays. They came from 150 years or even 200 years earlier. The Coventry cycle was 200 years before Shakespeare's day, performed by amateurs, would last all day, and you would get through the whole history of the world from a biblical perspective, from the expulsion of Satan from heaven to the final judgment of mankind. These were extremely powerful plays. In the Coventry cycle, whenever angels appear, like Gabriel to the Virgin Mary, the angels say, "All hail." That goes right through the cycle. Whenever something supernatural happens, when there's a supernatural appearance, they say, "All hail." Now, later in his plays, Shakespeare would give this line to a very different kind of supernatural characters, the witches in Macbeth. You remember, all hail Macbeth, all hail Thane of Cawdor. That phrase comes from the mystery plays. Very soon now, Queen Elizabeth would ban these plays because in a country that was riven by religious strife between Catholicism and Protestantism, the plays had become controversial. But it seems obvious that Will saw them as a boy because he references them several times in his plays. The most famous example being when Hamlet, instructing the players who are visiting Elsinore, he tells them about their acting and he tells them not to overact like a bad player who, as he puts it, out Herods Herod. Herod, the king, was a character in these mystery plays, usually given to the worst overactor among this amateur company because he has to rant and rave so much. But now in 1569, as I mentioned, something new and quite different than these amateur plays was about to happen. In his capacity as mayor, John Shakespeare was responsible for inviting and vetting professional touring companies of players from London to come to Stratford to perform. Where did they perform? They performed in the Guildhall, and people could come and see them there. That year of 1569, he invited two companies. The Queen's Men, you always named your company after whoever it was that was your patron, in this case, Queen Elizabeth. He invited the Queen's Men and the Earl of Worcester's Men. They performed in the Guildhall. Did Will Shakespeare see them perform as a little 5-year-old boy? It's impossible to know. But it's equally impossible to believe he didn't see some of the players' companies perform when so many of them came through Stratford, and his father had invited them. For instance, 10 groups of London's theater companies came to Stratford over the next 5 years, so 2 a year. In 1 year, 5 companies passed through on their touring circuit. Besides the Queen's Men and Worcester's Men, who came to Stratford 6 times each, there were the Earl of Warwick's Men, Earl of Oxford's Men, Leicester's Men, and Derby's Men, all playing there in Stratford. We can't reconstruct really accurately what it would have been like as a boy for Shakespeare to have seen these plays, but luckily he had an exact contemporary, someone who was also 5 years old in 1569, over in Gloucester, who did record doing this. And here's what he said. At such a play, my father took me with him and made me stand between his legs as he sat upon one of the benches, where we saw and heard very well a play of kings and courtiers, of songs and transformations and colorful costumes. This sight took such impression in me that when I came to man's estate, it was as fresh in my memory as if I had seen it newly acted. Hard to believe that one of those kind of times Shakespeare didn't have the same experience. Who were these theater companies and what did they perform? To understand that, we need to leave young Will in Stratford now, perhaps standing between his father's legs and watching a play, as the boy from Gloucester reported doing, and get a glimpse into a wider world, the world of popular entertainment in early Elizabethan London. Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558, and at around that time, 1558, so before Shakespeare is born, there are traveling actors. They've been traveling actors since medieval times. They'd put on farces and other entertainments. They've done them in these entertainments in market squares. They've done them in great halls of castles. They've done them in courtyards of inns, but there were no purpose-built theaters. Nobody thought of doing that. You just performed where you could. But there were purpose-built buildings for other entertainments, and they tended to be outside the city limits. This kind of stuff you didn't want inside the city. So there were a ring of entertainment areas, including houses of prostitution, outside the city limits. And one of the things they liked the best was bear baiting. So let's see our picture of bear baiting. Look at that. Look how horrible that is. Look how pixelated that bear is. Now you can see what's going on here. First of all, what I want you to see is how little that bear is. I guess they had small bears in England. But can you see that dogs are attacking that bear? That was the game. You put a bear, you can just see coming off of his back a little bit of a chain. You chained him to a stake in the middle of a round dirt circle, and then you set hounds on him. Does this sound like fun? And you bet which hound would die, which hound would maybe kill the bear. And you can see the guy who's, the kennels, by the way, are all around this. Now, this was a purpose-built sports arena. And that's why you can see up there people watching this. If you could see the whole arena, it was a polygon that had so many sides, it was almost round, sort of like a bull ring, right? Not as big as that, though, not nearly as big. And so these were there, and this was what Elizabethans thought was pretty good fun, was watching bear baiting. And it wasn't always a bear. Sometimes they put a bull in there. Then they did these other kinds of entertainments, some of them in those same arenas. Here's one of them that got remembered from the year 1559. It's just a bit of an entertainment happening in one of these places. This is from a diary of the time, someone who breathlessly saw and reported what the entertainment was. The next was that a number of men and women came forward from a separate compartment, dancing, conversing, and fighting with each other. Also, a man who threw some white bread among the crowd that scrambled for it. Right over the middle of the place, a rose was fixed, this rose being set on fire by a rocket. Suddenly, lots of apples and pears fell out of it down upon the people standing below. Whilst the people were scrambling for the apples, some rockets were made to fall down upon them out of the rose, which caused a great fright, but amused the spectators. This is the level of entertainment in early Elizabethan London. But at about the beginning of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, something brand new in entertainment happened. It's the sort of thing that happens only very rarely, though it's happened once in our lifetime. Here's the formula. New learning meets new technology meets entrepreneurship. New learning plus new technology plus entrepreneurship can create something brand new in entertainment. Think about the early days of personal computing in the 1980s. The new learning was computer science. The new technology was the ability to transform large, serious mainframe computers into small desktop machines that people could own personally in their homes. And then some entrepreneur invented Pong. Pong, a game you could play on your new technology home computer. At a stroke and with amazing speed, a whole new entertainment genre was born, computer gaming. The people who invented personal computers didn't see it coming. You needed the entrepreneur to get together with the new learning and the new technology. And by the way, Pong is still fun. Well, 400 years before Pong, in London, new learning plus new technology plus entrepreneurship created something even more revolutionary than computer gaming: commercial, secular, popular theater. So now we need to talk about how that happened. Because of dynastic civil wars, the European Renaissance came late to England. It had been in Italy for 100 more years and been in France, but it kind of came to England late. But when it came with a kind of startling thoroughness. In 16th century England, suddenly what every educated person needed to know, they needed to know the classics of antiquity, and to know those, not just churchmen who knew it in the medieval period, but the sons of aristocrats and ambitious men of the rising middle class needed to know Latin, and if they could, a little Greek. At England's two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, I think we got a picture of Oxford we can show, new faculty were hired, mostly from France and England, to teach this new learning, to teach Latin and Greek. And under their influences, that's what the universities switched to doing. And their literatures, the literatures of Greece and Rome, particularly Rome. Latin is a much easier language to learn than Greek. And that literature included plays. Latin plays were the most popular to teach, and especially those of two Latin playwrights, two Roman playwrights. One was Terence. He wrote comedies, and the other was Seneca. Seneca wrote blood revenge tragedies, real blood and guts things, real revenge tragedies. Because they taught him, because the plays of these two writers were considered models of pure Latin. So it's a good way to learn the languages. And frankly, that's really how the commercial theater started. Plays, along with Cicero's orations, Julius Caesar's war dispatches, Ovid's poetry, were just good ways to learn Latin. But the plays of Terence and Seneca cried out to be performed there in the schools. After all, students were now reading Aristotle, and Aristotle said that drama is an imitation of an action, in the form of action, not of narrative. So they started to put these plays on. And I didn't charge money, it was just for good fun there in school. They already had a good place to perform these plays, their dining hall. So now think of the dining hall that shows up in all the Harry Potter movies. That one is modeled on one at Christ Church College in Oxford. But all of the colleges have these dining halls. You know, an Elizabethan era dining hall still stands in London at a place called Middle Temple, which is the British version of a law school. In fact, it's still in use as a dining hall and occasionally a place for plays to be performed. The construction of Middle Temple Hall, and there's Jane standing by the outside of it, began 2 years before Will was born. And it was completed in 1573 when Will was 8 years old. Later on, much later on, in 1602, Will himself would perform in Middle Temple Hall in one of his own plays, Twelfth Night. Remember how that play begins? If music be the food of love, play on. Food, dining hall. There was a musician's gallery above where music could be played. Jane, you've been inside that hall. That's a picture taken from the music gallery. What's it like?
Well, it's my favorite building in London, especially the interior. It is, as you can see here, and this is a view from the musician's gallery that Tim's just referenced. It's one of those places that looks even bigger on the inside than you expect. And as you're up in that gallery looking down on those tables, which they're just about, it looks like they're in the middle of setting up for lunch, because they still have lunches there, and you probably recognize it from many film settings they set there in that room. It is just, it's a room that feels the most of any room I think I've been in that you've suddenly gone back in time 500 years. It's warm and you're surrounded by obviously artifacts and old armor and large paintings of King Charles, etc. But just the fact that it's a room that's still used for what it originally was intended adds to that sense of history and a place of being both now and back 500 years. So I just, it's a building that never ceases to provide more and more interesting history and so forth. And the porters there love us, and they show us around and take us down to the armory in the basement and the secret meeting rooms in the back. So it's a favorite place, and the students are it's always a treat to see the students' reaction when we go into this building.
Yeah, and so right in there, look how good the lighting is, by the way, big windows. That's where the plays, they would perform them, usually on a platform that was beyond where that picture can be seen. So first, students and faculty performed old Greek and Roman plays in rooms like that, and they did them in Latin. Then the plays were translated into English and performed in the halls there. So moves from Latin plays to English plays. But then the amazing thing happened. Using classical models, some clever students and faculty began to write their own plays and perform them in their college dining halls. They followed classical forms. In other words, they read their Terence, they read their Seneca, 5-act structure, but they also threw in distinctly English features from their own medieval plays and entertainments. So, you know, rockets and bread and things falling down, mumming, allegorical figures, and especially something that was not allowed in the classical plays, they mixed comedy and tragedy together freely. The title of Thomas Preston's play of 1561 sums up these early English Renaissance plays. The play mixes classical form and medieval farce wildly. It has characters in it from Greek mythology, English village life, and some allegorical characters like shame and diligence, and they're all mixed together. Here's the title of the play. A lamentable tragedy mixed full of pleasant mirth, containing the life of Cambyses, king of Persia, from the beginning of his kingdom unto his death, his one good deed of execution, after that many wicked deeds and tyrannous murders committed by and through him, and last of all his odious death by God's justice appointed. That's the title of the play. At this point, royalty gets involved. Early in her reign, Elizabeth went to Inner Temple Hall and attended the first of the English tragedies called Gorboduc, written by a couple of students, Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton. She likes it. And so she begins continuing her father's tradition of inviting new plays to court. And they're performed in court, especially during the Christmas revels period, which went from early December to about the middle of February. So now plays, there's an opportunity people see, because she would pay them to come and do plays there. So New Learning, that's all that classical learning, has created a new art form, English secular drama. Now it's about to get entrepreneurial because some of the classically trained playwrights from the universities decided to try their hand at getting their plays produced in London. These later were dubbed the University Wits. They were Thomas Kidd, Christopher Marlowe, went to Cambridge, Robert Greene, also Cambridge, Thomas Nash, he and Kidd were at Oxford. They're all graduates of these universities. It was the first generation of professional writers for the stage. They were going to give the public something new and hope they would pay for it. So now New Learning and entrepreneurism have joined, but there's one more vital ingredient required for the new art form to take off: new technology. Where would these university wits get their plays produced? Remember, there are no purpose-built theaters. In fact, the idea hadn't actually occurred to anyone yet. Liturgical dramas were performed in churches, traveling players performed in castle halls or inn yards. Nobody thought of building anything just for performing a play. So at first, the university wits partnered with owners of sports arenas like bear baiting places to get their plays produced commercially. They just throw up a temporary stage at sort of one side of the circle. But then John Brain, who owned an inn called the Red Lion Inn, sort of changed his inn a little bit in 1567, that's when Shakespeare's 3, kind of halfway to a purpose-built theater. But the real technological breakthrough came when a genius who was John Brain's brother-in-law was a carpenter and a building contractor, and his name was James Burbidge. And 9 years after the Red Lion Inn sort of changed itself to be a theater, he built in 1576, this is James Burbidge, the first purpose-built theater. And guess what he called it? The theater. It means place of viewing in Latin. He had to build it outside city limits, in this case, north in Shoreditch, where he lived. Here, for the first time, audiences who were used to kind of wandering in and out of arenas for popular entertainments are confronted with a single entrance and someone collecting money from them before they're allowed to enter. I say that's the moment professional theater was born. Okay, well, we'll catch up to these exciting new buildings in a few minutes when Shakespeare gets to London, but we need to get back to Will in Stratford now. I said there were two things that his father did because of his role as mayor and alderman. The first one was invite companies to come and play in Stratford. The second was to give his son Will a free education. That was a privilege of anybody that worked in city government. So Will is going to get essentially a graduate education in London in grammar school. At first, at the age of 5 or 6, Will went to what's called a petty school. And here, if we have the picture of the Guild Chapel, we could throw that up, because that's where this school met. This is where he learned to read and write and do arithmetic. Yeah, there it is. That's the entrance. You just go right in there. It's still used. It was a place to go to church, but it was also where this very early petty school, which you went to when you were 5 or 6 for about 2 years. His early reading would have been the Lord's Prayer and the Anglican Catechism. Also, from about that age, 5 or 6, you're expected to start attending church services at the Guild Chapel and also at Holy Trinity Church, where he'd been baptized. The boy heard a lot of sermons. and read a lot from a particular Bible that was, remember, this is before the King James Bible. It was called the Geneva Bible, which makes it sound like it was in Swiss, but in fact, it was a bunch of English Protestants that did the translation of the Bible in Geneva and became quite popular as a sort of home and family Bible. So in one way or another, Will learned his Bible very, very well. It shows up in his work in one form or another more than any other book, especially Genesis, the book of Genesis and the book of Matthew, although he actually there are references from 42 books of the Bible in his plays. The language of his plays also resembles the language of the Geneva Bible, that kind of tough, straight ahead, and yet poetic kind of language. But he was clever about it. I mean, here's a reference from the Geneva Bible. It's in King Lear. When Edgar sees the outcast Lear, he alludes to Christ's ordeal on the cross at Calvary. Edgar says, looking at Lear, "O thou side-piercing sight." Remember the sword that was thrust into Christ's side. Merchant of Venice. Shylock calls Portia a Daniel come to judgment. Yea, a Daniel, O wise young judge, how I do honor thee, referencing Daniel from the Old Testament. But my favorite of the many hundreds of references to the Bible is in Midsummer Night's Dream, because Bottom manages to mangle the scripture from 1 Corinthians 15. So Bottom is no Paul, but here's what he says, talking about a dream he had. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. All from the Bible. Well, from the petty school, Shakespeare advanced to the King's New School for 4 or 5 years. That was right next door, actually. You can see the tower of the Guild Church right there. And right next to it is the school that was called the Edward VI School, or the New King's School. And that's where Shakespeare went to school. Below, the part below the cantilever, that's the Guildhall. That's where the plays would have been put on. So it was all very compact and all quite close to where he lived on Henley Street. You went to school 6 days a week, from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Though you got to go home for dinner in the middle of the day. You learned Latin grammar and literature through reading, translating, memorization, and writing. You learned how to turn Latin into English and English back into Latin. We get many allusions to schooling in Shakespeare's plays, mostly comic schoolmasters and mangled Latin in the mouths of comic characters like Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing and Costard in Love's Labour's Lost. We also get a not entirely happy description in the 7 Ages of Man speech by Jaques and As You Like It of the schoolboy. Jaques refers to him as the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. Well, anytime school starts at 7 a.m., you'd find me creeping very unwillingly. In his 3rd year at the school, he translated Aesop's fables. He alludes to these fables 23 times in his plays. And he read, other than the Bible, the second book that's going to have the biggest influence on his writing. And that's a book called by Ovid called the Metamorphoses. It's a Roman book of Greek mythology stories. And he used stories and quotes from this book. They figure in one way or another as often as the Bible does in Shakespeare's plays. Remember in Midsummer Night's Dream, they do the play of Pyramus and Thisbe. That's straight from Ovid. In an early play of his, Titus Andronicus, a real blood and thunder play, Lavinia, who's had her tongue and hands cut off, in communicating to her father who did this to her, brings Ovid's Metamorphoses right on stage. Here's some lines from that. Titus says, "Lucius, what book is that she tosseth so?" Lucius says, "Grandsire, 'tis Ovid's Metamorphoses." Titus says, "Soft, so busily she turns the leaves. Help her. What would she find? Lavinia, shall I read? This is the tragic tale of Philomel, and treats of Tiresias's treason and his rape." So she uses the book as a prop and goes to the right story to communicate what had happened to her, since she couldn't speak or write. In the 4th year, he learned rhetoric, he learned oratory, he learned the arts of elocution, as well as how to write and recite speeches and letters and scenes in Latin. He learned that from imitation comes invention. After 4 years, Shakespeare had the equivalent of a master's degree today in Latin language and literature. More importantly, he'd learned rhetoric. He'd learned how to write and deliver verse and prose, speeches and aphorisms, and he'd picked up a storehouse of stories, histories, and literature. Jane, what's it like to be in that school?
Well, I'm going to share actually something that kind of sums up the kind of enjoyment in this. This is a couple of our undergrad students who are learning how to write with a quill, and they probably knew before, at one of those desks. I don't know how well you can see. The desk has all these carvings in it from centuries of young school boys for most of it, and then more recently young girls who attend this school, carving their names in the desk. You know, the first time, for years, we couldn't go into the school. And then a few years back, we saw that some of the young school attendees with their blazers and little badges for the Edwards School were letting people come in, and they showed us around and they talked about what it was like to go to school there. And it was fascinating. And some of them were actually putting on a play that they were taking up to London to perform at the Wanamaker Theatre next to the Globe. So there was a great kind of excitement of finally getting to go beyond those gates that we saw and go into the schoolroom. And then, of course, since then, we've been able to take travelers and students into the space. But it's a magical room because it's again still used for the purpose that it was built. It's not just a museum, it's a school, and the head of the school was very generous in talking about what it's been like to run that school, and the emphasis on students really getting a wide education, and the fact that these 13-year-old young men were playing all the parts, male and female parts, in plays that they were putting together was just really heartening to see that practice was still going on 500 years later. So
thank you very much. Well, armed with this education and fired by the plays from London that came through Stratford frequently, Will was ready to make his mark. But at what? At 17 or 18, Will fell in love. The woman of his affections was Anne Hathaway, who lived a half hour's walk away, as we pointed out, at Hewlin's farm in Shottery. I think we've got another picture of that.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote her a sonnet when he was a young man, probably 18 or so. It's maybe the first sonnet he wrote, although if you buy your book of sonnets, it's now Sonnet 145. And he managed to work her name into the sonnet. Here's how the sonnet goes. Those lips that love's own hand did make, breathed forth the sound that said, I hate, to me that languished for her sake. But when she saw my woeful state, straight in her heart did mercy come, chiding that tongue that ever sweet was used in giving gentle doom, and taught it thus anew to greet. I hate, she altered with an end, that followed it as gentle day doth follow night, who like a fiend from heaven to hell is flown away. I hate, from hate away she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you. I hate from hate away, Hathaway. That's a young man's poem. Somebody who really wants to be in love and hopes that the woman he loves is in love with him. So obviously all that education counted for something. He could write a sonnet. Even at this early outing, Will demonstrated the soul and wit of a poet. Will and Anne married in 1582. Their first daughter, Susanna, was born in 1583, and then twins, Hamnet and Judith, in 1585. Hamnet died as a little boy. When he became a mature man, he wrote another love sonnet to Anne, Sonnet 116. And I'd like Jane to read that for us and talk about the associations it has for you, Jane.
Got my old Riverside Shakespeare here. My high school graduation gift. So sonnet 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks. Within his bending, oh, I can't read this without my glasses, sorry about that. Riverside Shakespeare's tiny print. Within his bendings, sickles compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved.
Beautiful.
Oh, do you want me to say that?
Where might we find that sonnet on a brass plaque?
Well, let me just share this with you. This is a favorite spot at the Anne Hathaway Gardens, tucked behind the cottage, where the last, the line from sonnet 116 is on a little plaque there. This was a gift my father came up with and then recruited his 6 kids to help make happen as a surprise to his wife, my mother. And so I'm just going to share this other item with you, if I can get it to work. Okay, sorry, just a second. Oh, now I can't get it to work, sorry. There we go. That's the first photo on that bench. That's my father, who, along with Tim, is a Shakespeare professor, and he surprised her with that image back in when they were first creating that Shakespeare garden with plants and trees that are mentioned in the Shakespeare plays. So it's a really beautiful spot to go to at Anne Hathaway's cottage.
Thank you very much. Well, after Anne and Will had the twins, she had the twins, he didn't, in 1585, now come what are often called the lost years, when Shakespeare disappears from the record. We used to say until 1592, 7 years later, but remember that legal document that was discovered mentions him being in London by 1588. So now there are fewer lost years. At least we know some of what he was doing. Now, some Shakespeare biographers suggest he may become a teacher for a while up north in Leicestershire. In my opinion, that hardly leaves him time to develop the playwright's voice that's so evident even in his earliest plays. And we know he had a play, at least one play, written and produced by 1592. Early plays like The Comedy of Errors, Henry VI, Titus Andronicus. So here's what I think happened. I think he stayed in London after 1588. I think he went up to London to take care of his father's legal business. And by this time he was 24. I think when he was 25, 1588, 1589, he stayed in London. It was only a 2 days ride from Stratford to London. You could stop overnight in Oxford. There was a community of Stratfordians already in London. It was a regular thing for people from Warwickshire to seek their fortunes there. Will's Stratford friend, Richard Field, is an example of that. He was a printer and publisher, but he could only practice his trade successfully in a big city like London. He was to publish Will's poem, Venus and Adonis. The Queen's Men Acting Company had played in Stratford several times, including twice in 1587, the year before Shakespeare goes to London. Now, if you were a talented young writer and reciter of verse, you could find a place in a company as a player. And at first, what was called a mender of plays, because most plays, like TV series today, were collaboratively written. And there was always a need for a smart and sensitive writer to add or improve a needed scene. If you had a flair for reciting verse, well, so much the better. I think Will joined himself to the Queen's Men in that capacity. So I agree with the biographers. Peter Ackroyd put it this way: he may have been accepting an invitation from a group of players, and the prospect of making money as a player was greater than those currently available for a provincial teacher or a lawyer's clerk. It was soon commonly reported of players that some, quote, have gone to London very meanly and have come in time to be exceeding wealthy. If the best means of supporting his young family were to be found in London, then to London he must go. That's the end of that quote from Ackroyd's great biography. One strong piece of evidence points to Will's attaching himself to the Queen's Men, and that's that plays he later wrote had their earlier versions in plays owned by this company, including a play owned by the Queen's Men at this time called The Famous Victories of Henry V, another one called King Lear, another one called The Troublesome Reign of King John, another one called The True Tragedy of Richard III. So Shakespeare is around these plays. Did they inspire him to write versions of his own? So in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot smarter people than me, 1588, 1589, 1590, 1591, these were all years that Will was becoming Shakespeare. He was acting and writing with the Queen's Men. The exact chronology of his early plays can only be guessed at. Did he start with a comedy, Comedy of Errors, which is pretty much just an English version of a Roman play by Plautus that he would have read at school? Did he begin with a blood and guts revenge comedy copied from the Roman playwright Seneca, whose plays he had also learned at school, Titus Andronicus? We don't know. But what we do know is that by 1592, he had written a history play, The Tragical History of King Henry VI, and that it had been performed at the Rose Theatre. I think we have a picture of the Rose Theatre there. You can see that it's round and it looks a little like a bear baiting pit, except now there are plays being done there. We also know that this play in that theater had been a hit. We know this because it had made one of the university wits, Robert Greene, very angry and jealous. And so he slandered Will in a public pamphlet. Remember the university wits, these are the university trained entrepreneurial writers. They don't like a guy from Stratford horning in on their business. Things had not gone well for the university trained playwrights. Once entrepreneurs like James Burbidge began building and running purpose-built theaters, it was they and not the writers who controlled what plays got produced, and it was they who made the lion's share of the money. They paid writers like Greene for their plays, but they did not profit share with them. And there was plenty of money to be made from theater in London by the 1590s. Purpose-built theaters like the Rose, the Fortune, the Curtain, etc., they were outdoor arenas inspired by these bear baiting pits. There would be a 3/4 thrust stage that was about 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep. Space for seated audience members, as many as 2,500 of them, depending on the size of the theater, and a standing place around the stage in the yard for 500 more groundlings, as they were called, and they all paid to be there. In the 1590s, London's population was about 200,000. There were 5,000 spectators that went to the theater every week to be entertained. That's up to 10% of the population. A third of London went to a play at least once a month. There was money to be made, but it was the theater owners like the Burbidges that were making the money. So new learning, new technology, entrepreneurship was paying off handsomely, just not for the writers, who were hired hands, not profit sharers. Now, there were about 15 working playwrights knocking around London at this time, and they all knew each other. This was supposed to be the domain of the college-educated and poorly paid university wits. So in one of Will's early plays, we know it today as Henry VI, Part 3, he probably wrote Part 3 first. It was a hit, and so he wrote 2 prequels, Part 1 and Part 2. When that was a hit at the Rose Theatre, university wit Robert Greene was outraged. What right had this ill-educated, up-country bumpkin have to trespass on the Oxford and Cambridge men's domain? From Greene's point of view, only university-educated men had the right to write. This Will fellow was just a player, an actor, not a writer. With great vituperation, Greene wrote in a poisonous pamphlet called A Groat's Worth of Wit. A groat was the smallest, tiniest piece of money. A groat's worth of wit. This is what Greene wrote. Yet, he warns his fellow writers, yet trust them not. For there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. Let's break this down. Tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. That's Greene quoting from Shakespeare's play, Henry VI, Part 3. The actual quote is tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide. It's a description of a character called Margaret, who's a pretty bloody woman. Supposes he's as well able to bombast out a blank verse. He's a player. What is he doing? He's a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, and he's bombasting out a blank verse. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, which almost literally means jack of all trades, being able to do anything, but notice that Greene parades his knowledge of Latin there, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. This is the beginning of all the puns and jokes that were made about Shakespeare's name. Well, Will's transformation into Shakespeare now is almost complete. His education, far from being negligible, was extensive and perfectly suited to a creative poet who borrows from Latin models and stories and has rhetoric and oratory at his fingertips. His history of playgoing since he was a little boy prepares him and fires his imagination. His ambition to rise above what he can provide his family from jobs in Stratford goads him to London. In 1593, he seizes his own entrepreneurial opportunity. James Burbidge, noting Will's talent, remember he's the guy that built the theater, the capital T theater, noting Will's talent as a playwright and player, he does something unique. When you see talent, you grab it, right? And that's what James Burbidge does. When he's forming a new theater company with the first Baron Hunsdon as the patron, the Lord Chamberlain's men, and making them resident in his purpose-built theater in Shoreditch, he hires Will to be the new company's permanent house writer. He would now write exclusively for them and be paid for it. That had never happened before. The other 14 playwrights in London, like Greene, were freelancers who sold their plays to whoever would buy them and for whatever they'd pay. Now Will could write specifically for this ultra-talented group of players. James's son, Richard Burbidge, who would premiere all of Will's great tragic roles, Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, Antony, Coriolanus. The hugely energetic company clown, Will Kemp, who would play Sir Toby Belch, Lancelot Gobbo, and most famously Falstaff. And the most talented adolescent apprentices to play Rosalind, Juliet, and even Cleopatra. Perhaps Will was thinking of himself when he wrote this speech in his 1599 play, Julius Caesar. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. Will took the current. Do we have that picture of him in the Droeshoot engraving?
Mm-hmm. Hold on.
Let's throw that up now as our last picture.
Okay.
Will took the current. Within 2 years, he was not a paid writer for the Lord Chamberlain's men. He was a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's men. And he was writing the greatest plays of the Elizabethan Jacobean era. Will of Stratford had now become Shakespeare. Thank you. Now I don't know what we're supposed to do.
I think Sandra takes
I'm back, yes. Thank you so much, Tim and Jane. I learned so much. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know much at all about Shakespeare, so it was really a great webinar. If you ever go on a trip with Tim and Jane, they rent out the top part of, or they go to the top part of a pub in the mornings, and Tim and Jane lecture about different things related to theater. And there's just so many opportunities to hear them speak about things like this on the trip. And of course, see many plays. And we did have quite a few questions come in. So I'll go over those. In the beginning, you were talking about the church, and Sherry Wong asked, is the music recorded or does the church have an organ?
I'm somehow missing being able to see right now. I'm going to click, I'm going to join again. Oh, there you are. That's great. Okay. Yeah, the church has a really good organ, actually. It's a 19th century organ. It's not a big church. It's a parish church. And so, yeah, all of the main services done in the nave are done with an organ. Although there are also these side chapels that just have, when they're doing small services. But yeah, there's a really good organ.
Great. Angela asked, where is Middle Hall in London?
Do talk about that. You're so much better at geography than me, Jane.
So Middle Temple is, Tim mentioned kind of the legal section of London. So there's Inner Temple, Middle Temple, Gray's Inn, etc. And they're just really kind of to the east of kind of Trafalgar Square area, if that's an area of London you're familiar with. But just north of the River Thames, and along an area called the Strand, which is a really interesting street. It leads into Fleet Street, where the newspapers all used to be. So it's very central. It's just, if you went from Westminster Abbey headed east, you'd eventually get to Middle Temple Hall, but it's surrounded by other legal offices and the whole neighborhood where legal London existed.
Great, thank you. This says completely unrelated and not a question. Just want to thank Mr. Slover for Christmas Chronicles. It has become a family tradition. Could you tell us what that is, Tim?
That makes me very happy. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Some people think of it as a short novel. I actually know that it's simply me channeling the truth about Santa Claus.
Okay. Erica Wainsgard says, excellent presentation, thank you. And then Angela also asked, when was the Globe Theatre built?
It was the original Globe Theatre was built in 1599. What happened briefly was that that theater, called the theater up in Shoreditch, the person whose land it was on was not James Burbidge's. It was a different person, and he decided at one point to really raise the rent on the land. And so in response, over Christmas of 1598 going into 1599, the Lord Chamberlain's men with some carpenters, one of them was a man named Street, came and took down the theater. They took all the timbers and took them across the river. And by that time they had rented land across the river, quite close to the Rose Theater. And that's when they built the Globe. So it mostly went up in 1599. And the very first play that was performed there was probably Julius Caesar, the one with I did the quote from at the end. The reconstructed Globe Theater, the one you can go to now, was finished in 1997. And it took them way longer to build that one than the original one. And I remember one time asking that, why was taking them so long, and was really kicked to the curb for that question. They had no health and safety in the 16th century.
Okay, great. Mary Gilchrist says, thank you so much. Larry Milner says, good job, thank you. Ruby says, when is the next Shakespeare trip planned? Thanks, this was a great presentation.
Amber, you should answer that.
Yeah, well, hopefully, maybe in the spring, but probably in the fall. Right now we have the spring open. We're still enthusiastic and hopeful that it will go, but of course we have to play it by ear. So I believe that's still open on our website for a couple registrations. We have a few openings left. So if you visit our website, you can find more information about the trip there. And then Will Tepner says, when did the pub lectures take place?
No, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, well, I think that's maybe a jokey question from Will, who was a student on our undergraduate trip and got to learn a lot about Shakespeare over 6 weeks. So great to see Will there. The pub lectures take place with the Go Learn trips just down the street from where we stay. So in both kinds of trips, you either get a very concentrated education about Shakespeare or a leisurely 6-week education about Shakespeare.
Yeah, I sense your pain, Will. It's like, wait a minute, when we were there, we had all of our classes were in a classroom. Were you telling me that in the other trips you go to a pub? Yes. Yes, we do.
Go Learn is a little different than the, the undergrad trips. Okay, let's see. What is Shakespeare's relation to the Globe Theatre?
Well, he was one of the ones that put up money to build the Globe Theatre, actually. It was kind of a sad story. The Burbidges really wanted to build, they bought part of an old monastery on the other side of the river in town. They were going to build a nice small indoor theater called the Blackfriars Theater from the Blackfriars Monastery. And they did, they actually built it and they spent a lot of money on it. And then the town disallowed them from using that as a theater. And so they had to scratch around for money and they had to pledge money, and Shakespeare pledged some money. That's the time, about the time, because he'd been a shareholder for 4 years by then, that he had some money. So part of his relationship to the Globe Theatre is he was a part owner, along with the Burbidges, and Will Kemp was also a part owner of the Globe Theatre. And then of course, the other part was he was the house writer. So he premiered plays at the Globe Theatre and did that right up to 1610, which is when they finally also got into the Blackfriars Theatre. And so they had 2 theater homes then. And then finally, he performed on the Globe stage. He did give up touring later on, but he never gave up playing roles in his own plays and also in other men's plays. Ben Jonson, we know he was in plays of Jonson's too. So he really was all about the Globe Theatre.
Great, thank you. Susan Walker says, no question, just so much fun to hear Tim and Jane's excellent presentation, see familiar places, all ready to go again.
Yeah, let's go again. That's how you feel too, right, Jane? I mean, you talk about it and what you want to do is just go to it, right?
Okay, Dean Brooks says, oh, I think I lost, sorry. Dean Brooks says, do we know whether the portraits of Shakespeare are real and representative of how he looked? Does Shakespeare have any descendants?
Yes, there's no portrait that now exists that absolutely can be said to be sure to be Shakespeare's. The one that Jane showed at the end is known as the Droeshout engraving, because that's the guy who did it. The problem, and Ben Jonson, by the way, who wrote the preface to the folio, said it looked just like Shakespeare, but everyone doubts that Ben Jonson even bothered to look actually at the picture. So if there's if there's any image that has a claim, it's that one, but it's such a poor image. You know, it's such an odd picture. The eyes are not the same size. The head looks like a balloon floating, you know, kind of. So I think the one that I've seized on is the Chandos portrait. It's the one that's the one with the earring, and it just looks to me like that's what Shakespeare would look like. And we know it's from the right period and the right everything, but it's not necessarily true that that's Shakespeare. There's one that the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford pushes these days. It's a much handsomer one. But frankly, the impression you get is that they just wanted to rebrand all the souvenirs that other people had bought with other Shakespeare images so that they could buy them again. So no, there is no absolute proof, but the Droeshout engraving is the Droeshout engraving. That's the one that is the only one that can claim to have been done with somebody, Hemming and Condell, who published the folio, saying, yeah, that looks like Shakespeare. But remember, the folio didn't come out till 1623. That was 7 years after Shakespeare died. Maybe at the time of his death, when he was 52, the one that there's a bust of him in Holy Trinity Church. And maybe that looks most like him. The trouble with that one is that it was kind of painted, that in those days, they actually painted the portrait right onto the plaster statue. And so probably when it was first done, it looked a lot like Shakespeare. But then in the 18th century, that was considered to be in poor taste. And so someone whitewashed it. So it would just look more tasteful instead of all painted up. Since then, they've repainted it. But by that time, you know, the original painting and what he looked like was gone.
Great, thank you. Pat Pignanelli says, thank you for the wonderful information. Your words and pictures bring memories of my trips with you. Nicholas Dunn says, what a great and fascinating presentation. Thank you. After Shakespeare was made a shareholder with Burbidge, did other theater owners follow this concept and make playwrights shareholders of their own operations?
No. Isn't that interesting? The Lord Chamberlain's men, after Elizabeth died in 1603, changed their name. They became the Royal Company of King James I. So they became the King's Men. And when Shakespeare retired around 1614, 1615, they had groomed a writer to replace him. That writer was that guy. Why can't I remember his name? He co-wrote a couple plays with Shakespeare. He wrote Henry VIII.
Fletcher or
Thank you. Yeah, John Fletcher. So when John Fletcher replaced Shakespeare in 1616, he was offered a role as a shareholder. But by then, in order to be a shareholder, you kind of had to buy in. You know, you kind of had to have money to buy into the company. But I think it's so interesting that other theater companies did not follow suit. They continue to work with freelance writers.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Marilyn Hoffman says, very much enjoyed your presentation, learned a lot. I'm a regular attendee of USF, currently taking Boynton's course on sonnets and a big fan of British comedy, Upstart Crow. Thanks. Kevin Doyle says, do you have a current picture of theater? Not sure.
Oh, probably Burbidge's theater, right?
Oh, the theater.
Yeah, I mean, that got torn down a long time ago, so there were no current pictures of it, but contemporary pictures, I bet there are, but I don't know of them. They would be engravings or something, as opposed to photographs. I guess that's pretty obvious.
Tim, I'm sorry to jump in, Sandra, but there's a comment I think you'll like from Frank. I'm going to say his last name incorrectly, but he says, thank you. I'm now able to take on the Oxfordians who claim Shakespeare couldn't have done what he did.
Listen, I want to do another one of these. It just knocks in the head all those anti-Stratfordians. Oh, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
I mean, the two best sources I know about this are, first of all, Bill Bryson in his brief biography of Shakespeare. The whole last chapter is devoted to sort of why that's nonsense. And then Contested Will, a book called Contested Will. The whole book is about that. And that is by that Columbia University professor.
Shoot.
It's hard to get old. It's not no fun to get old and forget people's names. Anyway.
Not Shapiro.
What?
James Shapiro. Okay, James Shapiro.
And that whole book, Contested Will, is first of all, he says, look, Shakespeare scholars turn their nose up at this stuff. And so nobody will engage with these anti-Stratfordians, but I will, he says. So he spends several chapters laying out the case for the Baconians, for the Earl of Oxford people. He really goes all out. He doesn't just, dismiss them. And then finally, in the last two chapters, he kind of says, okay, now listen. and he shows why, why it can't be true. but at least he takes them seriously. And I think that's all they really want. And a surprising number of good Shakespeare actors are anti-Stratfordians. Derek Jacobi is an anti-Stratfordian. Mark Rylance is an anti-Stratfordian, which proves you can be a great actor and still be a blockhead.
Great, thank you. So Randy Black says, thank you for a very informative and interesting presentation. Kathleen Dustin says, what do you make of Marlowe's influence on Shakespeare?
Yeah, that I wish we had a lot of time for that. I think it was great. Anthony Burgess wrote a wonderful novel called Nothing Like the Sun. It's a biographical novel of Shakespeare. He also wrote a biographical novel of Christopher Marlowe called Dead Man in Deptford. And they're novels, but Burgess is a real smart guy. And he wrote a biography of Shakespeare too. And I love the relationship he draws in those books. They were almost the same age, but of course, Marlowe was one of the university wits. He went to Cambridge. And he was, in plays of his like Tamburlaine and Dr. Faustus, he did the best things anybody had done to iambic pentameter blank verse until Shakespeare came along. And it seems kind of obvious to me that he admired Marlowe, and perhaps, this is a mean thing to say, not entirely sad that Marlowe died prematurely. Got killed in that bar room. But he does, many people feel that a line from, I think it's either Twelfth Night or As You Like It, references Marlowe directly when he calls him that shepherd of might. That's an affectionate reference to Marlowe and his great poetry. If there's, the only person who could have written Shakespeare's plays that wasn't Shakespeare would have been Marlowe. The fact that he died before most of Shakespeare's plays were written kind of knocks that idea in the head, but he was that great. And if you ever get a chance to see, one of Marlowe's plays performed really well, and Faustus is the one that gets performed the most, but Tamburlaine, Edward II, all of these are amazing. They're absolutely worth seeing. There's a joke around that at some point the RSC was going to change its name to the Royal Marlowe Company and do all of Marlowe's plays. Well, they did.
Okay. Where was the quote from Will's visit to an early performance with his father when he stood between his legs?
Where's it from?
Yeah.
It's from the notes. I didn't write down all the references, but if you, let's see, how could you get it though? All you'd have to do is get the first line and put it, into a Google search, and it would take you to the source. Because I found it in one of the biographies that I read, but that's not the original source. So I'd have to go back to the end note of that chapter and see where that is. That's a pretty lame answer. That's the best I've got right now.
That's okay. Kathleen Gardner says, hi, Tim and Jane. I just wanted to tell you and everyone on here what an amazing trip the Go Learn trip to London is. I went in October 2016. I learned so much and feel nostalgic hearing from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ruby Thomas says, what Shakespeare classes do both of you teach? Are any of them in conjunction with Ocean?
The only Shakespeare course I teach is in London. It's called Shakespeare in Performance, and it's offered through the theater department and only in London. But I would love to, I'll say it now, I'll come out and say now, I'd love to teach an Oshir Shakespeare course if that's of interest. I'd love to do that.
Jessica Matthewson says Shapiro. I think maybe she was responding when you were.
Yeah, Shapiro. Thank you, James Shapiro.
Ann Decker says, please do take them on. You'll have an enormous audience for this.
Take on the anti-Stratfordians
Yes.
with boxing gloves.
Dean Brooks says, thanks Tim and Jane for this wonderful conversation, which illuminates and dispels some of the shadows of Shakespeare's life. Sadly, I still feel that the explanation of his genius remains incomplete.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a part of it that's unquantifiable. You know, I mean, maybe you read the biography of Steve Jobs that Walter Isaacson did. And he can lead you through, you know, how Jobs got educated and or ill-educated and all that kind of stuff. But there is that unquantifiable something that caused him to rethink the computer business. And I think that's true of Shakespeare too. But what I don't think is that it's entirely mysterious. I mean, for example, Shakespeare was not particularly gifted at making up stories. He wasn't a genius at everything. So he borrowed his stories. Almost every play, except one, except The Tempest, has quite identifiable sources. Many of those sources are other plays that other playwrights did. You know, Kidd writes The Spanish Tragedy, one of the university wits, and The Spanish Tragedy seems to be an antecedent to Hamlet, but there were also other plays called Hamlet. So partly he comes across as this kind of singular genius because we kind of repress the other writers and other writing that was going on at the time. We don't set him as much in his context as we would have. We also sort of don't like to say that some Shakespeare's better than other Shakespeare. You know, and we also, by the way, are unhappy that he collaborated with other writers, but he did. He didn't do it as much as other playwrights did. But, you know, he seems to have, for instance, taken over Titus Andronicus. You know, someone else wrote the first act. I can't remember, I think George somebody. And then he wrote the other four. He collaborated late in his career and maybe other times too. One scholar thinks even with Marlowe, maybe, that Marlowe helped write the first history plays, the Henry VI plays. That'll be fascinating. We know that Marlowe did work at the Rose Theatre, which is where they premiered. So I agree that there's an unquantifiable part of his genius, but there's a quantifiable part too.
Carolyn Ford says, thank you, it was delightful. Michelle Margit says, it's As You Like It, where you have the apparent reference to Marlowe's death. It strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room.
That's right. Thank you. That's exactly right. The Great Reckoning in a Little Room, the little room where Marlowe was murdered.
Mary Gilchrist says, that would be of interest in case you're asking, taking on the Strats. I think we just have one more question. I would like to go learn to have another presentation with Tim and Jane that takes up where this left off. Shakespeare the man, not the boy anymore. I can't wait.
We're always available. We're here all week.
Okay, sounds good. I think that was the last of our questions. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Tim and Jane, for always making time for us here at Go Learn. Anything else you'd like to say or close with?
Viva Go Learn.
Yes. Hopefully we'll be traveling soon, so if any of you are interested in joining Tim and Jane on a trip, you can visit our website. All the information is there, and we'd love to have you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.